I'm Margaret, 65 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My husband died one bitter winter morning, and since then my son Daniel and his wife Emily have kept their distance, as if grief had drawn a line that I was not allowed to cross. Birthdays passed in silence. Christmas came and went with no card, and even photographs of my granddaughter Sophie never reached me. I had almost convinced myself this was my life now, quiet, pared down, waiting for the phone to ring, though it never did. That morning, in late November, I shuffled down to the mailbox the way I always did, expecting nothing more than a grocery flyer. Instead, nestled among the folds of paper, was an envelope the color of old ivory. The handwriting stopped me mid-step. I knew Daniel's slant, the way he pressed harder on the downstrokes. My hands trembled as I tore it open right there on the curb. Inside was a card with painted leaves and a turkey, and a few words that nearly undid me. Mom, we'd love to have you for Thanksgiving this year. Please bring your bourbon pecan pie. Love, Daniel. I pressed the card against my chest and stood in the cold air, trying to steady my breath. After years of silence, after being treated like a ghost in my own family, he wanted me there. I carried the envelope back upstairs like it was holy, placed it on the table beside my tea, and stared at it until the steam from the cup blurred the edges. By Tuesday, I had baked the pie twice, just to be sure I hadn't lost my touch. I ironed my best blouse, polished the shoes I rarely wore, and folded the scarf Emily once said looked lovely on me. On Thanksgiving morning, I tied up the pie with a towel, slipped Daniel's card into my purse, and whispered to the empty apartment, maybe this year will be different. I had no idea that by nightfall, that same pie would sit on the seat beside me like a cruel joke, while words sharp as knives cut me out of the family I thought I was returning to. The drive to Daniel's neighborhood took just over half an hour. The streets were lined with bare trees and scattered leaves, and every house seemed to glow with the comfort of family gatherings. I hummed softly to myself, balancing the pie on the seat beside me, trying to remember how it felt to belong somewhere. When I pulled up in front of Daniel's house, I paused for a moment, just to take it in. The porch was trimmed with a garland. A pumpkin sat by the step, and warm light spilled from the windows. For the first time in years, it looked like home again. I carried the pie carefully, the towel wrapped around it still warm against my palms. My heart pounded as I walked up the path, rehearsing how I would greet them. I imagined Emily's smile, Daniel's hug, Sophie running to my arms. I lifted my hand and knocked twice, soft but steady. The door opened, and there she was, Emily. For a second, her lips curved into something like a smile, but the moment her eyes met mine, it vanished. Her gaze dropped to the pie, then back to me, colder than the November air. "You weren't supposed to come," she said flatly. I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay calm. I got Daniel's card. He asked me to bring the pie. Her head tilted, her expression tightening. He wasn't supposed to send that. You know how things are. It's better if we keep it simple this year. She paused, her eyes sharp as glass. You're not really family anymore. Before I could answer, the door clicked shut. I stood there, holding the pie, the scarf still around my neck, my breath clouding in the cold. For a moment, I thought I might knock again, but my feet carried me back to the car instead. When I slid the pie onto the passenger seat, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. 3 blocks away, I pulled over, staring at the card still tucked in my purse. I whispered into the silence, "Did I imagine it all?" I sat in the car with my hands locked tight around the steering wheel, the pie cooling beside me like an unwanted gift. The neighborhood was alive with laughter spilling from windows, the kind of sound I hadn't been part of in years. My chest rose and fell too quickly, and I kept telling myself to drive away, to spare myself the humiliation. But the card in my purse burned like proof I couldn't ignore. I pulled out my phone and typed a message. "Daniel, I thought I was invited." My thumb hovered, then I pressed send. The screen glowed back at me with nothing, no dots, no reply, just silence. For a second, I wondered if Emily was right, if maybe I had misread everything. Maybe Daniel had written the card out of obligation, not love. Then my phone rang. His name lit up the screen, and my breath caught as I fumbled to answer. "Mom, what do you mean? You thought you were invited." "You were invited. I wrote that card myself." His voice cracked through the quiet car. I swallowed hard, fighting to hold steady. "Emily told me I wasn't really family anymore. She said you shouldn't have sent it." The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Finally, Daniel spoke again, slower, clipped. "She told me you said you didn't want to come, that you were too tired, that you didn't want the noise." I pulled the card from my purse, unfolding it with shaking hands. "I have it right here. Your handwriting, the pie request. You said you'd love to have me." Daniel's voice tightened. She knew exactly what she was doing. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." "Daniel?" "No," I whispered, but he hung up before I could stop him. I leaned back against the headrest, my body aching with a familiar weight, the ache of being told I didn't belong. I straightened the towel over the pie as if that tiny act of order could steady me. Then I stared at the empty street, waiting for the headlights I knew would appear. 12 minutes later, headlights swept across the street and slowed beside my car. I knew the way Daniel parked, angled just a little crooked, like he never fully learned to stop rushing. He stepped out before the engine died, his shirt sleeves rolled, his face tense with something I hadn't seen since he was a boy trying to fix a broken project the night before it was due. He came to my window and knocked gently. I lowered it, my hand still trembling. He held up an envelope, identical to the one in my lap. "You still have yours?" he asked. I nodded and lifted it. His jaw tightened. Same pen, same card, same Tuesday night. I wrote them both. She watched me do it. I swallowed, my throat raw. She told me I wasn't family. She looked me right in the eye and said it. For a moment, Daniel closed his eyes, breathing hard, the muscles in his face pulling taut. I let her handle everything, invites, birthdays, even the calls. I thought she was just organized. I didn't realize she was... His voice trailed, but the anger in it filled the space between us. I opened the door and stepped out, pie still in my hands. The scarf around my neck felt heavier now, more like a reminder than comfort. "I don't want to cause a scene," I said quietly. Daniel met my eyes, firm and steady. "If you don't go in, I won't either. I'm not going to sit at a table where you've been erased. You're my mother, and if she has a problem with that, she can explain it to everyone else." His words stunned me. For years I had been shrinking, making myself smaller to avoid trouble. Now he was standing tall, making space for me. He reached for the pie in my hands. "Come on," he said softly. "I'll carry this. You carry the truth." Together, side by side, we walked toward the house. The porch light glowed steady, the wreath perfectly straight. This time, I wasn't alone when I knocked. Daniel didn't hesitate this time. His knuckles hit the door 3 times, firm and loud, nothing like the soft, uncertain knock I'd given earlier. The door opened slower than before. Emily stood there, her eyes darting from the pie in his hands to me just behind him, Color drained from her face. "Daniel," she said, her voice sugar-sweet, too smooth. "What's going on?" Instead of answering, he lifted both envelopes, his in one hand, mine in the other. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" His voice was steady, low, and sharp. Emily blinked, her mouth parting. I thought she declined. She said she wasn't feeling well, that she didn't want to come. Her glance flickered toward me, quick as a blade, then back to him. I didn't want to stress her. "Don't lie," Daniel snapped, his voice cutting through the hum of voices inside. "You told her she wasn't family. She stood on this porch with the pie in her hands while you shut the door." I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to speak. She said it right to my face. A voice came from deeper inside the house. "Daniel?" It was Karen, his sister, stepping forward with a wine glass in hand. Behind her, people turned from the dining table, conversations dying into silence. Even Sophie hovered near the stairs, her small brow furrowed in confusion. "She turned my mother away," Daniel said, his voice louder now, carrying across the room. "Told her she didn't belong." Karen's lips parted in shock. "Is that true?" I nodded once, my throat thick. I wasn't going to say anything, but Daniel deserves the truth. Then Sophie crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me with a force that startled me. "I'm glad you're here, Grandma," she whispered. Her hair still smelled of rosemary. The room stood frozen, all eyes on Emily. She said nothing. Daniel shifted, his voice calm but resolute. "Come in, Mom. Tonight you sit at the table. With me." And this time, no one stood in my way. The dining room was too warm, but not from the oven. Heat radiated from tension, from eyes that flicked toward me and then quickly away. I stepped inside slowly, clutching the scarf at my chest as if it could anchor me. No one spoke. Karen cleared her throat and gestured toward the chair beside her. Daniel pulled out the one next to his. "Sit here, Mom," he said, his voice gentler now. I lowered myself into the chair. The wood felt stiff and foreign beneath me, but the gesture was enough. Across the table, Sophie caught my eye and passed me the basket of rolls with a small smile, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Emily moved around the table silently, filling glasses, her gaze never once landing on me. She didn't apologize. I didn't expect her to. Instead, I studied the table itself, linen napkins folded neatly, polished candlesticks glinting in the light. I remembered wrapping those candlesticks as a Christmas gift years ago, back when Emily still called me Mom, grace was said. But the words washed over me in fragments. My ears were tuned for something else, a whisper, a scoff, a sigh. None came. The food was beautiful. Mashed potatoes smooth as cream, carrots glazed with honey, stuffing heavy with sage. I placed a little of everything on my plate, careful not to seem ungrateful. Halfway through the meal, Sophie's voice broke the tension. "Grandma, remember the time you made a pie and forgot the sugar?" I laughed before I could stop myself. "That was a lemon chess. Your grandpa ate the whole thing and pretended it wasn't awful." Daniel chuckled. He said it was an acquired taste. A few people smiled. Even Karen shook her head fondly. For a moment, the air shifted. Emily sat 3 seats down, her fork barely scraping the plate, her silence heavy. But I didn't look her way. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I was simply here. The Monday after Thanksgiving. The air outside carried the sharp bite of winter coming early. I was still replaying the night in my mind, the hushed room, Sophie's hug, the silence that followed Emily's lies. I thought I would feel broken, but instead I felt something steadier, like a crack had let in light. That morning, Daniel called. His voice was quieter than usual. "Mom, want to come with me to the thrift store?" "For what?" I asked, half smiling at the unusual request. "A table," he said simply. "Something small, big enough for pie, maybe a game of cards." I knew then what he was really saying. Just in case next year looked different, we needed a place that was ours. We walked through the aisles of worn wood and chipped paint, the smell of dust and pine cleaner heavy in the air. My fingers brushed over scratched tabletops, crooked legs, drawers that stuck. Then I saw it, an oval table, faded carvings along the edges, steady enough despite its age. It wasn't perfect, but it had space for 4 chairs. "This one," I said softly. Daniel lifted it without a word, loading it into his truck. Back at my apartment, he carried it up the narrow stairs and set it in the center of my kitchen. He gave the surface a little tap, like sealing a promise. "Can't wait to eat here." When he left, I stood staring at that table for a long while. It looked awkward in my small kitchen, but I didn't mind. I rolled up my sleeves and began to bake, not because someone expected it, not to prove I belonged, but simply because it felt good to let cinnamon and sugar fill the air again. The pie cooled on the windowsill, the house warm with scent and quiet hope. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting to be asked. I was building a seat of my own. A year later, my apartment smelled of roasted garlic, pie crust, and nervous hope. The thrifted table Daniel and I had carried up those narrow stairs had been sanded and stained a warm honey brown. It still wobbled slightly on one leg, but I had grown fond of the tilt. I set out mismatched plates borrowed from neighbors, folded napkins that didn't match, and glass cups sitting beside plastic ones. Nothing was perfect, but it was mine. I had written every invitation by hand, no mass texts, no digital RSVPs, just folded cards, sealed and tucked into mailboxes with a simple line, "Come as you are, bring only yourself." Daniel arrived first, balancing a turkey in one arm and a 6-pack of ginger ale in the other. "Smells incredible in here," he said, kissing my cheek before setting the bird down on the counter. "The table looks good, too." Karen came next with a bundle of wildflowers wrapped in butcher paper. "They don't need to match," she said with a wink as she arranged them in a chipped vase. Sophie bounded in behind her, wearing a jean jacket covered in enamel pins and confidence. She plugged a small speaker into the wall and played a playlist she proudly called Grandma Vibes. There were 7 of us in total that night. Chairs borrowed, food imperfect, laughter spilling across the table. Every person there had chosen to come. Emily didn't respond to the invitation. No one mentioned her name, and for the first time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was space, open and unbothered. The meal was chaotic in the best way. Sophie burned the rolls. Daniel knocked over the cranberry sauce. Karen forgot the gravy in the microwave. We laughed until our stomachs hurt. When the bourbon pecan pie came out of the oven, Daniel raised his glass. "To Mom," he said, "for teaching us that family isn't managed. It's chosen." My throat tightened, but I smiled, letting the words settle into the walls of my home. The morning after Thanksgiving, my apartment was quiet again, but it wasn't the hollow quiet I had known for years. This was a quiet that felt earned, like the room itself was resting after holding so much laughter. I padded into the kitchen in my robe and wool socks, the faint smell of cinnamon still lingering in the air. Plates were stacked by the sink, crumbs dotted the table, and a crumpled napkin lay where Karen had scribbled down her recipe for apple pie. I set the kettle on the stove and turned toward the table. 7 chairs stood there. 6 of them had been filled the night before. The 7th was still tucked neatly under the edge, untouched. For a long time, I just stared at it. That empty chair had once symbolized the invitation I'd spent years waiting for, a place at someone else's table that was always denied. But now, looking at it, I felt something different. I realized I didn't need to wait anymore. I had written the cards, cooked the food, and pulled people into my home with my own hands. The ones who came brought themselves, not obligation, not guilt, just presence. That seventh chair wasn't a wound anymore. It was a reminder that I had made space, and space was enough. The kettle hissed and clicked. I poured the tea, added a swirl of honey, and carried the mug to the table. Without thinking, I reached for that empty chair and pulled it out. Then I sat. Not as a host, not as a guest, but simply as me. My phone buzzed on the windowsill. A message lit the screen. Best Thanksgiving ever. Love you, Grandma. It was from Sophie. I smiled, my hands warm around the mug, and typed back slowly, Love you too, sweetheart. Outside, the wind carried leaves past the glass, but this time I didn't feel like the seasons were leaving me behind. This time, I had chosen where to sit. In the weeks that followed, the apartment no longer felt like a stopover, some temporary corner where I waited for the phone to ring. It felt lived in, shaped by the people who had finally gathered here. Every crumb left on the table, every mismatched chair reminded me of something I had thought I'd lost forever: belonging. I spent more afternoons baking, not out of duty, but out of pleasure. The scent of butter and cinnamon drifting from my window had neighbors knocking on the door to ask what I was making. I gave away slices of pie to people I barely knew, and in return I received small smiles, new conversations, threads of connection I hadn't expected. Karen called more often too. She spoke less about Emily and more about plans of her own. Small things like visiting antique shops or taking Sophie to the library. It was as if the confrontation on Thanksgiving had stripped away a wall, leaving room for simple honesty. One Saturday, Sophie appeared with her sketchbook under her arm. She sprawled on the floor while I sat at the new table, peeling apples for another pie. She showed me drawings of a girl sitting alone beneath a tree, shadows curling around her. I traced the lines with my finger and told her it reminded me of how I once felt, shut out, waiting on the edge of someone else's story. She didn't ask for details. Instead, she leaned her head against my knee for a brief moment before turning the page. That small gesture rooted me. For the first time in years, I felt I wasn't clinging to scraps. I was planting something real, something that could grow beyond me. The past still ached, but it no longer defined me. I had a table, a granddaughter's trust, and a son who stood beside me. Renewal wasn't a grand event. It was in the small, steady choices to stay, to bake, to open the door again. As winter deepened, I found myself looking at the table each morning as if it were a living thing. The wood was scratched, the wobble never quite gone, but it anchored me in a way nothing had since Harold's death. It reminded me that life could tilt and still hold steady. One evening, I sat with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker through my window. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. Next year, let's do it here again. Same table, same pie. I smiled, not because I needed his confirmation anymore, but because it was freely given, unclouded by lies or silence. I thought of Emily then. She hadn't reached out, hadn't explained, hadn't apologized. For a while, that absence gnawed at me, but slowly I realized I didn't need her words. Her choice had carved out a space I'd been too afraid to claim. Without her rejection, I might still be waiting on a doorstep, holding a pie that grew cold while my hope drained away. Now, I was no longer waiting. I was choosing. Sophie's drawing still sat on my counter, pages full of shadows and light. One sketch in particular stayed with me, the girl under the tree. I taped it to the fridge, a reminder of what had changed. That girl no longer sat alone. She had walked into a room, taken her place, and pulled out her own chair. I glanced at the table, 7 chairs circling it. My hand lingered on the back of the empty one, not with sadness, not anymore, but with anticipation. Because next year, maybe, we'd need 8. The future didn't scare me the way it once did. It stretched wide, imperfect, but mine. And for the first time in years, I knew I was no longer erased. I had written myself back into the story. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.